There are Hollywood legends, and then there is Charles Bronson. Even 2 decades after his passing, the man continues to haunt the imagination of film lovers, cultural historians, and anyone who ever watched him walk across a screen with that granite jaw and those cold dark eyes that seemed to have witnessed every misery the world had to offer. He was not pretty in the conventional Hollywood sense. He was something else entirely, something rawer, harder, and ultimately more honest. And yet, for all the millions of words written about him, for all the documentaries and retrospectives and tribute reels, the real Charles Bronson remained stubbornly out of reach. He preferred it that way. But now, years after his death, his daughter has stepped forward. And what she has confirmed has sent ripples through the entertainment world, not because it is scandalous in the tabloid sense, but because it is deeply, unexpectedly human. The rumors that circulated during his lifetime about his tenderness, his fears, his private grief, and the man he truly was behind the iron curtain he drew around himself have finally been given voice by someone who actually knew him. Not the myth. The man. To understand what his daughter has confirmed, you first have to understand where Charles Bronson came from, because his origins were so extreme, so marked by poverty and loss, that they seem almost invented by a scriptwriter trying too hard to create a backstory. He was born Charles Dennis Buczynski in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, a coal mining town so small and so bleak that it barely registered on any map of consequence. He was the 11th of 15 children born to Lithuanian immigrant parents. His father, Walter Buczynski, was a coal miner who died when Charles was just 10 years old, leaving the family in a state of poverty so acute that Charles once wore his sister's dress to school because there was nothing else available. He never forgot that. He carried it with him for the rest of his life, sewn into the fabric of everything he did. He went down into the coal mines himself as a teenager, earning $1 for every ton of coal he extracted. It was back-breaking, lung-destroying work, and the darkness of those tunnels, literal and figurative, shaped his understanding of what human endurance truly meant. When World War II arrived, he enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces and served as a tail gunner, flying missions that routinely placed him at the most dangerous position on a bomber aircraft. He was awarded a Purple Heart. When he came home, he had seen enough of death and darkness to last several lifetimes. He drifted into acting almost by accident, studying at the Pasadena Playhouse in California and beginning to pick up small roles in films and television throughout the early. He changed his surname from Buczynski to Bronson partly due to concerns about anti-communist sentiment targeting people with Eastern European names during the McCarthy era. The new name suited him. It was blunt and hard, like the man himself. For years, the entertainment industry did not quite know what to do with him. He was not handsome in the way studios understood handsome. He was not smooth or charming or easily categorized. Directors used him as muscle, as background, as the threatening presence lurking in supporting roles. It took European cinema to recognize what American Hollywood had overlooked. In France and Italy, audiences went absolutely wild for him. They saw something in that face, a lived-in authenticity, a physical poetry of toughness that resonated with their own post-war sensibilities. Italian audiences affectionately nicknamed him Il Brutto, meaning the ugly one, and yet the name carried enormous affection rather than insult, because what they meant was that he was real in a way that conventionally handsome actors simply were not. The French embraced him as one of cinema's sacred monsters. In Japan, his fame reached such extraordinary heights that his name once appeared on a single sign stretching an entire city block. He became a massive star in Europe long before America caught up, earning salaries that dwarfed what most of his contemporaries were making stateside. At the height of his fame, he was reportedly earning close to £2 million per film, a figure that would have been incomprehensible to the boy who once wore his sister's clothing to school in a Pennsylvania mining town. He negotiated his contracts with the shrewdness of someone who had known genuine deprivation and was not about to be taken advantage of by anyone, regardless of how powerful they were or how famous their studio. When Death Wish arrived directed by Michael Winner, America finally understood what Europe had known for years. Bronson played Paul Kersey, a mild-mannered architect whose wife is murdered and whose daughter is assaulted by street criminals, and who subsequently transforms into a one-man vigilante force. The film was controversial from the moment it was announced. The role had reportedly been offered to Clint Eastwood, Frank Sinatra, and Henry Fonda before landing with Bronson. Fonda reportedly found the material distasteful. Bronson did not. He found it true. When Winner told him the role was available, Bronson's response was characteristically blunt. He said he would like to do it. When Winner clarified whether he meant the film, Bronson corrected him. He meant he would like to shoot muggers. The film was made on a budget of $3.7 million and earned extraordinary returns, breaking box office records at certain New York venues that had previously been held by The Godfather. It sparked fierce cultural debate about crime, justice, and whether ordinary citizens had the right or even the obligation to defend themselves when institutions failed them. Bronson himself argued that he saw the film as a cautionary tale rather than an endorsement, famously invoking the principle that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. But he understood why people responded to Kersey the way they did. He had grown up in a world where no one was coming to save you. What the public saw of Bronson in those years was the performance on screen and off. He was famously difficult to interview, responding to questions with monosyllables or long silences that reporters found either maddening or magnificent depending on their temperament. He famously told the film critic Roger Ebert during an interview that he was more entertained by his own thoughts than by the thoughts of others. He did not apologize for this. He did not perform warmth he did not feel. The Swedish director Ingmar Bergman, having observed him closely, described him as a man whose face was etched in violence and meant it as the highest possible compliment, the recognition of a face that carried real history rather than manufactured drama. His on-set behavior was equally formidable. There were stories of him intimidating strangers as a young man with nothing more than a bottle and the force of his presence. There were accounts of him breaking a sergeant's arm in a military brawl. There was the documented incident of him physically confronting a director during a disagreement about a scene. These were not the actions of a man performing toughness for an audience. They were the actions of a man who had been genuinely hardened by genuinely hard circumstances, and who had never fully shed the survival instincts of the coal miner's son from Ehrenfeld. And yet, paradoxically, this is precisely what made the warmth he did feel so remarkable to those who witnessed it. Because the rumors were always there, threading through the official narrative of the stone-faced tough guy. People who worked with him, crew members, younger actors, people who spent real time with him on location would occasionally let slip that there was something else going on beneath the surface. That he could be quietly and unexpectedly generous. That he possessed a sense of humor so dry and so perfectly timed that it could go undetected for several minutes before landing with full force. That he was devoted to his family in a way that was almost old-world in its completeness and its sincerity. And that he painted. And that he sculpted. That he pursued these creative outlets with genuine seriousness and genuine talent, working under the pseudonym Binsky specifically so that his artwork would be evaluated on its own merits rather than on the celebrity of the name attached to it. His paintings sold well under that pseudonym. They sold well because they were good, not because they were made by a famous man. That fact clearly mattered to him enormously. These were the rumors. And now his daughter has confirmed them. Katrina Holden Bronson, who was adopted by Charles and his beloved second wife Jill Ireland, has spoken in ways that crack open the carefully maintained legend and reveal the complicated, tender, frightened, loving human being inside. What emerges from her account is a portrait that is in some ways more impressive than the myth, because it is real, because it was witnessed at close range by someone who had no reason to embellish and every reason to be honest. She has confirmed that her father was a man of profound and genuine gentleness within the walls of his home. This gentleness existed in direct proportion to the harshness of the world he had come from. Having grown up in a household where there was never enough food, where children wore each other's clothing, where death came for a parent far too early and without any ceremony or softening, Bronson was determined that his own children would know abundance. Not just material abundance, though there was certainly that, but the abundance of a father who showed up. Who was present. Who brought his children to film sets whenever he could manage it. Who named a 260-acre Vermont farm after his daughter Zulika. Who organized his professional life, as much as a globally famous film star possibly could, around the rhythms and needs of his family rather than the other way around. Katrina has also confirmed something that touches on the stranger, more vulnerable edges of who her father truly was. Bronson, for all his screen invincibility, was a man genuinely haunted by specific and consuming fears. His phobia of germs was real and serious, leading him to avoid physical contact, particularly handshakes, in ways that sometimes read to outsiders as coldness or arrogance but were in truth manifestations of deep and long-standing anxiety. Fans who approached him at public events sometimes walked away feeling dismissed or rebuffed, never knowing that what they had encountered was not contempt but fear. His daughter's confirmation of this gives those encounters a different and more sympathetic meaning. His fear of fire was equally real and equally consuming. During the production of Death Wish it became known among the production team that Bronson absolutely refused hotel rooms above the second floor. His reasoning was straightforward and revealed a man who had thought carefully about catastrophe. He needed to be able to escape if a fire broke out. The man who on screen walked calmly into danger, who faced down criminals and never flinched, who projected an image of total fearlessness that man could not sleep comfortably in a room from which escape was not immediately and physically possible. His daughter has spoken about these contradictions not with embarrassment or apology but with a kind of fierce and protective love. They were part of him. They were earned by everything he had lived through. There is also the matter of Jill Ireland, and here the story becomes both more beautiful and more heartbreaking than any film Bronson ever made. He met Ireland while filming The Great Escape in the early. She was married at the time to Scottish actor David McCallum, and Bronson reportedly told McCallum with his characteristic blunt directness that he intended to marry her someday. It was not a boast or a provocation. It was simply a statement of what he believed to be true, delivered in the quiet, certain way that Bronson delivered most things. And he was right. Ireland and McCallum divorced, and she and Bronson married in, following Bronson's own divorce from his first wife, Harriet Tendler, with whom he had 3 children. The relationship between Bronson and Ireland was, by all credible accounts, the central love story of his life and the emotional foundation upon which everything else rested. She was his intellectual and emotional counterpart, warm where he was cool, verbal where he was silent, openly expressive where he was sealed shut against the world. Together they raised a blended family of 7 children in a Bel Air mansion that stood as far from the coal mines of Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania as the human imagination could reasonably stretch. He insisted on casting her in his films whenever possible, and over the course of their marriage she appeared alongside him in 15 productions. It was his way of keeping her close, of weaving their lives so completely together that the line between his professional self and his private self became, at least in her presence, less heavily fortified than it was anywhere else. When Ireland was diagnosed with breast cancer in the mid-dash, Bronson stood beside her with a steadiness that those close to the family described as quietly extraordinary. She fought the disease with tremendous courage for years, writing a memoir about her experience that became a bestseller and introduced her to a new audience of readers who had known her only as an actress. She died in Bronson was with her. Those who knew him well said that he was never entirely the same man afterward. Not visibly, he continued working, continued presenting the same weathered and unreadable exterior to cameras and journalists, but in the private ways that actually matter, in the quality of his silences, and in the particular way a life carries forward after its center has been removed, he was changed. His daughter has spoken about the depth of that grief with obvious care and feeling, confirming what many people suspected but could never prove, that beneath the famous toughness was a man fully capable of loving someone so completely and so permanently that losing them was not something you recovered from so much as something you learned to carry. The years following Ireland's death brought changes that Bronson navigated largely on his own terms and in his own way. He eventually found companionship again with Kim Weeks, a younger woman who remained at his side through the increasingly difficult final chapter of his life. His health deteriorated in ways that were both predictable, given his age, and cruelly ironic, given his history. Hip surgery came first. Then lung cancer, the disease that connects, in a grim and unspoken line, the coal dust of his Pennsylvania childhood to the hospital room in Los Angeles where he would eventually spend his final days. He retired from acting without ceremony or fanfare, which suited him perfectly, because ceremony and fanfare had never been things he sought or valued. The last years were not without pain beyond the physical. His former wife Harriet Tendler made public accusations suggesting that Kim Weeks had managed access to Bronson in his final days in ways that prevented family members from visiting him as he struggled with respiratory failure, metastatic lung cancer, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The accusations became a public dispute that Bronson himself, fading and private to the last, could neither address nor escape. For a man who had spent his entire adult life guarding his privacy with something approaching ferocity, to have the intimacies of dying become public argument must have been among the heaviest of the many heavy things he carried. He died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 81 years old. The obituaries were respectful and sometimes genuinely moving, but they dealt mostly with the legend with Death Wish and the 5 sequels, with a European stardom, with a famous face and the famous silence. They touched only lightly, if at all, on the man his daughter has since described. The painter working under a false name so his art could be judged honestly. The father who brought his children to film sets and named a farm after his daughter. The husband who cast his wife in 15 films because he could not bear to be separated from her. The man who refused hotel rooms above the second floor because he needed, always, to know his way out. He left behind an estate valued at approximately $75 million in current terms. His properties included the 33-room Bel Air mansion, the Vermont farm, and a home in Malibu. He left behind more than 100 films spanning 5 full decades of cinema. He left behind a daughter who became a film director, carrying the family's conversation with storytelling into a new generation and a new century. And among his most personally cherished possessions was a painting called Scoop Town. It depicted the coal mining community where he had been born and raised, the place he had spent his entire career and his entire life technically escaping. He kept it. Of everything he had accumulated across a lifetime of achievement, so improbable that it strains simple description, the mansions, the international fame,